All right, so how many of you are in software? Some? How many of you are wearing clothes? Yeah, okay, so I'm here to talk to you about fashion and software, but mostly about fashion. So fashion has been around since our earliest legends, right? Adam and Eve come out of the garden, they notice they're naked, and they reach for a fig leaf. And that fig leaf is arguably the first fashion object. What's a fashion object? Well, it's part of fashion theory. It's this theory that fashion comes from somewhere and it moves through a cycle. And so fashion objects have certain characteristics. They change, like a fig leaf. They are mostly about looks, not functionality. They represent the collective taste of a group of people. You choose what you wear partly because of what your friends wear. They're conspicuously often new or designed. You can tell that they're designed, and they have a lot of meaning to people. There's ego involvement with fashion objects. That's what makes something a fashion object instead of, well, just an object. And they're about how people differentiate themselves socially. So by that definition, I think it's pretty clear that we're at the point where software is a fashion object, just like a pair of shoes. And what this means is that it has those characteristics. So where do these fashion objects come from? Well, one place that fashion comes from is that it trickles down to us from elite tastemakers. A historical example of this in fashion history would be Queen Elizabeth. She was the fashion icon of her day. She had a huge influence on fashion in Europe, not just England, and throughout the late 1500s. But Elizabeth had a problem. See, the thing you need to know about the Elizabethan era is it's the time of the great chain of being, and who you are in society is really important. Your rank, your status is really key. But with the rise of the merchant class, suddenly you can't tell who is who. You can't tell a lord from a tailor. So Elizabeth re-implements the sumptuary laws, which say what you can wear depends on what your status is. Only the queen gets to wear cloth of gold. And you have to be an earl to wear certain types of fur. And if you think about it, this isn't that different from what operating systems have done in terms of enforcing certain standards since the advent of the graphical user interface, right? If you're a non-native app, there are certain features you just don't get. So if we look at Elizabeth again and we look at Paris Hilton, we can say, oh yeah, here we can see it, right? Here's her status. Right here we can see on both of them they're wearing their jewelry. But Paris here is actually an example of the other direction that fashion comes from. And that's that it can come up from the bottom to the masses. So it can come from a lower status or a smaller group and trickle up. In this case, bling, street style. Suddenly every sorority girl is wearing it, your mom's wearing it. It's the way everything is. So an example of this trickle-up fashion from history is another queen. Now, this is Marie Antoinette. You may not recognize her here because she doesn't have the big hair or the big dress. In fact, this portrait was scandalous back in 1783 when it was first painted and seen by the public because people expected their queen to look like a queen on the right. And what she was doing was she was adopting style markers from the lowly shepherdess in a very idealized form to make a statement about how she wanted court to operate and why she instituted the Petit Trianon, trying to establish a sense of intimacy. And this still happens today. Every time we see Mark Zuckerberg in a hoodie instead of a power suit, he's making a statement about what he is and what his status is in society. So fashion can come from the top. Fashion can come up from the masses, and I think open source is really the key to this, although most open source UIs are a little iffy. But regardless of where it comes from, it all moves through the same cycle. And if you're in software development like me, you think this cycle looks like the software product life cycle, but this is actually the fashion cycle. This is a cycle every fashion object goes through. It's got tastemakers, leaders, early adopters, then it peaks and it's in every magazine, and eventually only your dad wears it. And this cycle has been moving faster and faster over the course of history. What you can see is as we reach the end, it gets tighter, and that's because now we have sewing machines. There's the Industrial Revolution. We get faster at making clothes, just like we're getting faster at making software. But look at what happens in 1840. Men fall off the map of the fashion cycle. And there's a reason for that, because in 1840, trickling up from bankers comes the men's sack suit, which peaks in the Victorian era and has remained the standard for men's business wear through today. So what can we learn from this? Well, software, in the grand scheme of things, is relatively new, but fashion isn't. And by looking at what has made certain fashions persist, we can design better fashion objects that are software.